Okay. Well, hopefully you had an enjoyable networking break, and we are going to dive right back into it with a really fascinating panel titled Army Logistics and Network Dependency. It's my honor to introduce our moderator. I actually mentioned her this morning already, Lieutenant General Retired Pat McQuistion, AUSA Senior Fellow. I've worked for General McQuistion 2 times in previous commands of hers at the 21st TSC, the 21st ASC. Her culminating position in the Army was the Deputy Commanding General of Army Materiel Command. No better person to moderate this panel. So, Pat, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jack. I really worked for him. Everybody knows that. Okay, so how many of you seen the TV show Hot Ones? Anybody seen that? It's an interview show where the panelists, the interviewee asks some very succinct questions, but the responder has to first take a bite of a hot wing before they prepare it. And the hot wings get hotter as they go on. That's kind of our theme for this panel. Ask the hot questions. These guys can take it. But it was also an opportunity to say that there is an AUSA store out there. And before you leave, please visit Desi out there and see if there's some AUSA. Okay, so in preparing to moderate this panel, I read the recently released National Defense Industrial Strategy that several of you have mentioned today in the previous panels, and Jack talked about it this morning. But I wanted to go back to its introduction because I got excited about this. You know, I thought I'm really out of date because I have been away from the Army for a while. But listening to all of the topics today, I do feel like I'm right back at home. I know that there has been a lot of progress since I have left, but the issues are very similar to the issues we have faced over the past 30 years. So the introduction to the NDIS, which is its inaugural publication, that there is a National Defense Industrial Strategy in writing and released, I think is a thing that we ought to celebrate and read. Over the past century, U.S. industrial might overwhelmed the Axis powers in World War II and contributed significantly to deterring the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The peace dividend and procurement holiday that followed saw dramatic cuts in military force structure, weapons production, and corresponding stockpiles of munitions and materials. And that's kind of where we find ourselves today. Jack talked about the Last Supper. That term was coined. There was a meeting that Les Aspin, who was the Secretary of Defense at the time, in 1993, invited 20 to 25 industry leaders to a dinner at the Pentagon and discussed the need to take the peace dividend and the procurement holiday with these CEOs to set the stage for what would be a lowering of the defense budget. But in that time, so we still spent a significant amount of money over the past 30 years, but there has been a decline, a huge consolidation of American industry. And now we're going to take a look and see how we can mitigate some of the results of that 3 decades. So in the last 3 decades, the People's Republic of China has become the global industrial powerhouse in many key areas, from shipbuilding to critical minerals and the microelectronics that vastly exceeds the capability of not just the United States, but the combined output of our key European and Asian allies as well. The events of recent years dramatically exposed serious shortfalls in both domestic manufacturing and international supply chains. COVID-19 demonstrated America's near wholesale dependency on other nations for many products and materials crucial to modern life. The Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, followed the next year by attacks by Hamas on Israel, uncovered a different set of industrial demands and corresponding risks. The U.S. defense industry has been called on to surge production of military equipment in large quantities, especially munitions, from 155 millimeter artillery shells, a staple of armies since World War I, to the most sophisticated missile defense systems. The National Defense Industrial Strategy, the first of its type to be produced by the Department of Defense, provides a path that builds on recent progress while remedying remaining gaps and potential shortfalls. It recognizes that America's economic security and national security are mutually reinforcing, and ultimately the nation's military strength depends in part on our overall economic strength. And of note, the new NDIS addresses resilient supply chains as a top priority. Now, I took this as very useful document, and also is something that's both aspirational and can help to set us on a path toward remedying all the vulnerabilities that we have been talking about today and that this panel will address from a network perspective. More than 2,000 years ago, Sun Tzu wrote, "The line between disorder and order lies in logistics." One might update that today to add, "And the line between order and disorder in logistics lies in the network." In recent history, the U.S. has enjoyed relatively uncontested freedom of movement across multiple domains, including network and cyber. But with near constant attacks and intrusions and network vulnerabilities, that is no longer the case. What must the Army prioritize and protect to ensure continuity of sustainment capabilities that are heavily dependent on network connectivity? It's now my great pleasure to introduce our panel members. I will introduce each of them and then turn it over for initial comments from them while we wait for your questions to come in. Our first speaker is Brigadier General Jake Kwon, the Director of Strategic Operations, Office of the Deputy Chief of Staff, G357. General Kwon was commissioned from Vanderbilt University back in 1999 as a quartermaster officer and served as a lieutenant in the 194th Maintenance Battalion in Camp Humphreys, Korea. So he's got theater experience. He deployed with the Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force Afghanistan for Operation Enduring Freedom as well. He has served up and down the East Coast and overseas with logistics assignments in the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment at Fort Liberty, North Carolina. It took me a while to get used to saying that. He deployed in 2005 to support Operation Enduring Freedom, then transitioned to the Army Reserve in 2006, where he's held multiple leadership positions, including commanding the Headquarters Detachment, the Joint Reserve Element at the Defense Logistics Agency here nearby Fort Belvoir, the Executive Officer and Acting Commander for the 5th Battalion Ordnance of the 80th Regiment in Abingdon, Maryland, Joint Strategic Planner in the Joint Staff J7, and then with 3rd Brigade Ordnance of the 94th Division Force Sustainment. He commanded the 378th Combat Sustainment Support Battalion at Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, then became the Chief of Staff of the 143rd Sustainment Command Expeditionary in Orlando, Florida. And at one point in time, that was the largest unit in the Army, the most dispersed. Is that still the case?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. General Kwon next assumed command of the 77th Sustainment Brigade, Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst, New Jersey, and deployed to Kuwait in support of Operations Inherent Resolve, Spartan Shield, and Freedom Sentinel. His most recent command was of the 316th Sustainment Command Expeditionary in Coriopolis, Pennsylvania. He assumed his duties as Director of Strategic Operations this past August. And in his civilian career, thank goodness, General Kwon works with a cybersecurity company that specializes in endpoint security and cyber threat intelligence. Go ahead and have some of your hot sauce, and I'll go on to General LeMasters.
You promised wings, ma'am. I'm a little disappointed here.
They're coming. Had a logistics problem. Next on the panel is a former neighbor and co-worker, Major General Clark LeMasters, United States Army retired. He is currently a consulting employee with Leidos, one of our sponsors for today's event. From June 2022 to December 2023, he served as Vice President for the Logistics Division and Managing Director, responsible for a 6.5 billion pound, and that is monetary unit, not weight, logistics, commodities, and services transformation program supporting the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense. Clark completed 34 years of service in the United States Army and was a career sustainer with many Army and joint assignments. A few of those included Commanding General of U.S. Army Tank Automotive and Armaments Command, TACOM, Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations and Logistics, U.S. Army Material Command, we were neighbors there, Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, I said that already, Commanding General of the 13th Sustainment Command, Expeditionary, Deputy Commander Support Operations NATO Training Mission Afghanistan, Chief of Ordnance and Commandant of the U.S. Army Ordnance School, HUA. During his career, he served overseas in Germany, Iraq, Qatar, and Afghanistan. He holds an AS degree from Marion Military Institute, a BA degree in chemistry from Frostburg State, an MS degree in systems management from Florida Institute of Technology, and a master's of strategic studies from the U.S. Army War College. He lives in Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina, and is up here today with us. And the best thing about Clark is his wife, Cricket, and his kids. That is a fact. Rounding out the panel is Dave Poland, retired Army Colonel and now Client Solutions Executive for the AT&T National Defense and FirstNet. Dave joined AT&T after serving 32 years in the Army, the regular Army and active reserve as an armor officer, an engineer, a systems automation officer, and information network engineer. He attended a War College fellowship at the Fletcher School for Law and Diplomacy, earned an MS in systems management from the University of Southern California, and a BS in finance from West Virginia University. So I'm going to turn the panel over now to have opening comments from each of the panelists. We have a couple of questions we can address, but we'd really like to get to yours, so please pass those up as quickly as you can. So General Kwon, can you give us some perspective about this broad and important topic?
Yes, thank you, ma'am, and thank you for that introduction. Let me start by saying thank you to AUSA and all the senior leaders and all the industry individuals in the room. I mean, I understand everybody's got very busy schedules, as we're kind of getting after the same fight here. But first, let me start by saying contested logistics, as we all know, it's not a new concept, right? We've faced challenges both getting to and then fighting and moving within theaters of operations in previous global conflicts, and there are multiple historical instances that go back to the dawn of time. However, the changing factor that is really kind of punctuating today is the ubiquity of global networks. Couple that with a increasingly aggressive pacing threat. We now, for the first time in recent history, we don't enjoy relative geographic safety from adversaries and physical damage like we have in the past. As such, the armies of 2030 and Army 2040 will require a transformation of how we think of, train for, deploy to, and sustain the fight across multiple contested domains. Sustainment, like all warfighting functions, will be network reliant with workloads protected from cyber and electronic attacks. Key force multipliers will be the ability to not only share data and establish decision dominance across our Army, but with those of our joint and coalition partners. So how do we get there? The first step is not just acknowledging that the character of war is changing, but also to understand what that means and adapt the way we think to an ever-changing battle space. As we strive to maintain that advantage during competition, we have to continually reevaluate and refine concepts and capability developments so that we can maintain that ability to introduce dilemmas into our adversary's decision space during competition and crisis to avoid conflict. We can achieve this, though, and it will be done in partnership with our sister services and coalition partners by taking that critical look on how we will leverage capabilities such as artificial intelligence to help commanders integrate, analyze, and understand greater volumes of data to make decisions faster and at greater scale. But we should also look to leverage machine learning because while people often couple those together, they are actually distinct and apart to learn from past data and produce anticipatory models to assist with predictive logistics. So while we're exploring those solutions for intelligent and cognitive communication systems that adaptively utilize transport bandwidth, which is something we've never had to think about in the past, to maintain connectivity in contested environments, we also have to ensure that we keep an eye toward those distributed operations in denied spaces and be just as fluid in performing in a disconnected environment. But we also have to do this without building an iron mountain of data, because this requires that deliberate understanding of what data is important to us to make those particular decisions, what networks and data sources we have to protect, think zero trust, that's one of those fundamental concepts there, and then be able to field coding savvy warfighters who can program apps at the point of need as conditions and mission requirements change. So we have to remain cognizant of how we're going to move that data across the battlefield and in the right amounts. Simply saying, as some commanders are wont to do, I've been guilty of it in the past, of saying, I want it all, is not going to be sufficient. We're going to have to create, and be able to work through those transport and storage problems, even as we host certain data stores in cloud environments. Now, I will finish up my part and then transition over here to our distinguished brethren to my right in terms of the fact that the Army cannot, nor should we do this alone. We recognize the partnership with industry and that we have to work by, with, and through to ensure that we're getting best-in-class technologies that can address requirements for the future fight. We also have an obligation to communicate those requirements. So while we're getting better as an Army at becoming more agile, industry, you guys are very forward-thinking, and you have a tremendous amount of agility compared to us when it comes to innovating new technologies and taking those risks, which is a tremendous strategic advantage for our country when we optimize those relationships effectively between the Army and the industrial base. Sir, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot. Those of you that know me are probably going to say, why is he sitting on a network panel? Because I can spell network. I know when the little bars on my phone work that's what I want to see. You know, it's like the old saying about with logistics. Yeah, I want a lot of it. That's what I want with the network. But the other thing General McQuistion didn't tell you about these is if we do not like your question, we can throw them at you. So just be sure you identify who you are. General Kwon, thanks for those comments. I think it sets the stage. As I was mentioned, I was a career logistician, and I watched the evolution of what we termed as a network back to the days of, you know, trying to transmit things through AM radios over FM radios, EPLARS networks. VSAT grew and turned into something real. It gave us a logistics advantage we'd never seen, satellite radio, and now look where we are now. There's not one person in the room that hasn't checked their network today at least 3 or 4 times or transmitted some data to somebody confirming pickup time at the front door or whatever. It is absolutely part of our life. And General Smith said several times during his remarks today, you know, access to the network is critical to what we do as sustainers. Data and systems and the influence it has on our decision-making process is critical. And General Kwon just mentioned this. I had written it down earlier this morning, is that it can't be about the Army network, or that's where it's going to end. It's about a joint network. It's about a global network, and our industry partners are absolutely, you know, we cannot function without a network that operates resiliently in a cyber domain. It touches everything we do: planning, deployment of military, and across the commercial transportation networks, our supply chains, and it has to be there for us. I'm really proud to see that the chief has got it built into his number 2 priority as we go forward, you know, getting those forces deployed as we go out. We know the threat's real. Just like you may have checked your network here, you've probably been hacked or spammed once or twice over the last 24 hours about something. I thought Colonel Henry's comments this morning and those examples that she gave are real, and we know it, we hear it, we see it. It's being talked about, and there's much more that we can't talk about. And the comment that was made about General Lyons saying fight to get to the fight is absolutely right. With the threat that we have now that can take commercial networks and turn it against it, they don't have to go inside the fence and attack DoD networks. They just have to clog the port, or they have to influence a crowd to be at a certain place to keep a ship from being loaded. That is amazingly disruptive. And the interesting thing, as you all know about the cyber domain, is that there is no tyranny of distance. There's no limited range on that domain. You can sit in your basement somewhere in the world and you can influence someone on the other side of the world instantaneously. It's an extremely challenging and scary thing. Thank goodness that we have a group of amazing cyber warriors, both in the commercial industry side and in uniform, that literally are fighting the fight right now as we sit here 24/7, 7 days a week. Those are the men and women that are really doing an awful lot that we don't hear about as we go forward. And it's good to know that we've got them on their side. And I thought some of the things Colonel Henry was talking about made a great deal of sense about how we organize ourselves to get into that. Within this network cyber contested environment, you know, to me, all the effort that's going on and looking at the problems that we face in logistics, we've got to get after those really, really critical single points of failure. How do we identify those? I was taken by an article I read not too long ago about the James Webb Space Telescope and that device, that very complex piece of equipment that they put into orbit out of the reach of any way that we can service it. They went through a very detailed single point of analysis failure on it to determine the 344 things that could literally go wrong with it. And they just tested the heck out of it to make sure that it worked. And it did flawlessly, in fact. You know, what's our element? How are we doing that? How are we going to do, you know, that failure modes and effects analysis on the network? And how are we going to not just look at the DoD network, but as was mentioned earlier, those commercial elements of the network that allow us to deploy those forces and sustain those forces, and also the supply chains around those. And was mentioned by Dr. Jetty, the vulnerability of those paths ways and what that means to us to enable our operations. How do we get after the problem? How are we organizing ourselves to get after the problem? What's the solution? Is this going to be a Manhattan Project event, or is this going to be another special designation to somebody in the joint force to be responsible for something and it doesn't get off the ground without the right emphasis? And it was mentioned earlier today is, how do we then garner that support? General Formica mentioned the importance of being able to tell that message. Dr. Jetty mentioned how important it is to get that in front of Congress and empower that with the resources and time that's already stretched absolutely to the limits. How do we do that, and how do we make that happen? And how do we map it and then set those priorities and then really get after it? Are we going to do this with a nationally mobilized, focused effort on a war, which we haven't seen since World War II and probably won't see, let's hope not, till the, as we've seen in the previous conflicts. But how do we take advantage of those commercial networks who are operating but still focused on the commerce of the world, the economies of the world, and making profit, which is what they're there to do, and balance that? How do we develop that plan, and how do we get after this in the world of Army logistics? And how do we determine those single points of failure and really focus ourselves on solving those initial problems and getting the resources that we need? Just some thoughts. Dave.
So far, I'd like to thank you all for the opportunity to come here to speak. This is the third time I've been on a panel for AUSA, and I've always enjoyed it. I've learned quite a bit today, some things that surprised me, some things that didn't. But probably the biggest surprise I've had is that I came to an Army meeting, and I'm the only guy with PowerPoint. Can you call my first slide, please?
Great point.
I had a streak going. In 1992, I had to buy a color printer so that Colonel B.B. Bell could print plastic slides for the overhead. And as a lieutenant, I learned the importance of slides. So, all right. So earlier today, several people used the phrase the whole of nation, and I've often used the term whole of society. Industry today is in the middle of or fighting cyber warfare every day. I've often said or been saying that I want to get credit for a Revolution of Military Affairs term, that when the Russians went into the Ukraine, they found themselves fighting a crowdsourced global war, because they weren't just in the cyber domain fighting nation states. They were fighting corporations that came after them. They were fighting individuals in their basement who came after them. And they had all of those individuals at one time. But American industry is facing that same challenge also every day. We have a crowdsourced threat. We have nation states that want to get into our networks, that want to take advantage of our financial industry. You have criminals, mafias, all sorts of groups always trying to get into your network. And when it makes a headline when a network does get penetrated, but by and large, our networks hold up very well every day. And so this is why I'm making the case that the partnerships we've been talking about all day should certainly be the main effort with the cyber domain. And with partnerships, what I mean is, instead of building your own stovepipe systems, instead of coming to me where the Army wants to build its own 5G network, buy your network as a service and allow network to do the job. The United States has the 3 largest telecoms in the world. And when you look at the top 10, all 10 of the largest telecoms in the world are either American or US allies. That's a pretty big team to bring to the fight day one. And right now, we also own spectrum. Spectrum gets very, very congested. And so if we can share spectrum between the DoD and industry, and then also share innovation, the commercial world gets paid to lead in innovation. So this is all things that the Army can tie into and ride that wave, so to speak, instead of bearing the burden of trying to invent things themselves. The statement, when at war, prepare for peace, comes from Sun Tzu. I think most of at least one of our adversaries is probably familiar with this phrase. And what I mean by that is, when I ever talk about defending the network in terms of Taiwan or Russia, they always talk about, well, they'll cut our fiber, they'll shoot down our satellites, they'll do all these things. But one thing the adversary has to understand is, even if they win, on the day after the battle, they're going to want to resume trade, and they have to do commerce with the rest of the world. And if they destroy everything and create an unnatural desert for them to operate in, they're really shooting themselves in the foot. So some of the network, at least the infrastructure, is going to have to survive for their own benefit. One thing I'm depicting here in the graphic is all domain activity, where services are agnostic to transport. So it doesn't matter if it's fiber, if it's satellite, if it's improved fiber we're working on that is more difficult to cut, that it can take any pathway out. The enemy cannot cut off, jam, or intercept or disrupt all means of transport at the same time. So if your services are agnostic to transport and one piece of the network is blocked, you simply can move on to the next. Can I move on to the next slide, please? So one of the ways, there are several things we're working on that we can do. One of them, what is the minimum baud rate at which you can operate at war? What is really important? Signature can be detected and you can be targeted. So you're going to have to minimize how much of a signature you put out. Talk only when you need to talk. So what is really that critical piece of information? We talked a lot today about having the right stuff in the right place at the right time. One of the things we're working at with sensors with IoT is tracking items down to the very close, exactly where it's at and how many you have at all times. And this IoT can be supported through 5G, which has a relatively small footprint. And then we're back to transport. How are you going to transport it back out? Within diversity of service, one of the things that the DoD can do to work with industry is help us develop common standards so that all of your carriers and all of the commercial industry can work with you. That also means perhaps accepting commercial standards, which seems to be working quite well in our day-to-day lives. In our graphic, I'm showing a satellite, the PLEO, Proliferated Low Earth Orbit, where you put up a lot of satellites that are low orbit, they're inexpensive, and they're difficult to shoot them all down at one time. But you also have fiber backhaul. We're looking at ways in which now that we can have direct to satellite devices, which not only means your cell phone, but it also means perhaps a container or one of the automated vessels we talked about earlier today, that you can track that via satellite wherever it is in the world. Another advantage of working with industry and using commercial standards is that you tend to blend in with the noise. It's my understanding the Russians are having a difficult time figuring out what is an enemy force and what is just the regular people of Ukraine using their telephone system. So you're going to want to use the spectrum local to where the fight is so that you can blend in. To the question of how can you rely on industry that is concerned with profit and growing their business during a time of war, the answer is that we have to now work out what you're going to need in the theater and put together the contracts and the service level agreements now. We have a FirstNet, which is a first responder network here in the United States. Day to day here in Arlington, everything's quiet. When you pick up a phone, you're making a phone call like anyone else. But in an emergency, network is shifted to first responders. And if necessary, we actually preempt people off of the network so first responders have that network. We need to have those service level agreements and those details worked out now so that in the middle of the fight, we can move at the speed of mission and not the speed of DoD contracting. And that's all I have, ma'am.
Thank you so much. There's a lot to unpack there. I was reminded about our log cap contracts. Mick, you could certainly, maybe we need a net cap, like we have log cap in each of the regions of the world. Something you're talking about is having something worked out in advance, and have to think about that a little bit more. We did get a couple of questions from the audience. They're both addressed to General Kwon, but he may not be the only one who responds. Pick one, Jake.
All right, thanks, ma'am. And yeah, it looks like, for a crowd that just ate lunch, you guys really aren't as asleep as I had hoped you might be. Okay, so the first one I got was, on this one, it says, thanks, you mentioned several times that contested logistics is a joint fight problem. How nested are we across the services to solve our common problems and potential joint solutions? So there's a few things I can highlight, one of which is our efforts, so from the Army, from the G357 side of it, working in conjunction with the G6 and the other 6 community. I'm sure everyone's heard of JADC2, and everybody's got their own different definition of what that might mean. And then, of course, throw the C on the front for combined joint all-domain command and control and what that means. But The good news story is that there are several initiatives out there. And as a matter of fact, I'm actually going to head out to the West Coast here toward the end of the month and a couple times next month to look at some of this in terms of project convergence and Capstone 4. You've heard of that down at Fort Liberty. But we're also nested in staying abreast of the other services efforts in terms of Project Overmatch, what the Air Force is doing with ABMS, and then even at the joint staff level with Bolt Quest. So there are different initiatives that are out there, all conducting that experimentation and staying in contact with each other to ensure that those lessons are learned. The biggest thing that the chief has, and for those that are in the building with me, that we've heard is every time you go up for a prep or you want to have a discussion with the chief, he's going to ask you, how does this contribute to the joint fight? So the service parochialism, he is working viciously to move past that. And that also includes in terms of some of our acquisition strategies, in terms of looking at where can we leverage existing programs that are already out there. The previous stovepipes that used to exist for various reasons, whether you want to blame culture, communications, or just the fact that you may as well be in another country sometimes if you got to go down the stairs or across 2 corridors in the Pentagon. But we're working vigorously to break those stovepipes. And then one other item that's out there in order to ensure that there's that joint fight and getting after those stovepipes. I mean, so there is an initiative right now, OSD led, coming out of the CDAO office, and they have a senior leader data and AI education course. But that is not exclusively one service that's in there, and they're very deliberate about it. And right now it's at the flag level, SES level, and they're bringing in individuals from all services and from the different defense agencies in order to ensure that they're getting that education to understand what is data, how can you leverage it, what is AI, what is machine learning, and kind of dispel some of the myths, but also to establish those cross networks so that we can approach that problem better. Gentlemen, I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on the topic.
I do on that one.
Okay, so we've heard a lot in recent years about China's investment in their backbone logistics systems, both on the military side and on the commercial side. So China has invested quite heavily in a single logistics system for their armed forces. We in the U.S. and with it only gets exponentially more challenging when you think about tying in with our allies around the world as well and the other services. We have many logistics, enterprise resource planning, and then going on down from the capper ones for the services, all of the systems that feed into those. There's been some remarks made in the press that the U.S. ought to go to a single logistics system. We hear a lot about data mesh efforts now, and we do have a question here. How do you see the emerging data mesh, unified data reference architecture from DAS as movement toward development of data products, getting the right data or information to the right decision maker at echelon? And this is from the logistics information perspective. So there's a lot to parse there, but give you a couple of seconds there to think about.
So I guess
what's the answer?
I don't know what the answer is, but I think a couple of things we probably have to think about. It was mentioned earlier today, I think by Mr. Snow, about computing at the edge. And it's, as you look at the network and where we need the information, I think we all have to have a little bit of a session to ourselves that says, what do we really need to know? I mean, what is the information data that is out there that's absolutely critical to us to be able to meet the chief's number 2 priority and get forces deployed? And what is the stuff that's administrative, policy, regulatory, that's driven, like IUID and some other things that are really, really important to us, but maybe they don't enable the fight? And how do you bucket some of that information to get a little bit what Dave said about, limiting the bandwidth and what the targets are and how we fit into a spectrum? So I think we probably really have to come to terms with the information that we have and what's really critical. We're inundated with our ability to pull up Amazon and see exact, hey, he's turning the corner right now, I can walk out. We don't need that. You do not need to know. You need to know what time the part gets there, what time the team needs to be in the motor pool to fix it, what time my delivery's coming, when do I need to link up? You don't need to track it all the way from the world. Some places, they do need to see that. General Lawrence's team needs to understand that when he looks at resources around the globe. But I think we have to have a really close discussion about what is really, really critical. And then I think back to the industry side is what's that information that's out there in industry that's got to be shared into the network. And, a smart systems architect once told me that, vulnerability exists at those interfaces. So those commercial systems interfacing with an enclave, if we don't have a single ERP that we're all operating in, and we have to do, the zero trust, we have to do things to reduce risk. How do we look at how we protect those as single points of failure? Some thoughts.
I'm not sure that you really want one individual system. I like the idea of a system, network of networks that's more easy to, I think, defend each enclave. And that way, if something is compromised, again, sort of like when I mentioned earlier, if your fiber's blocked, you go by satellite. If one system goes down, you have another system to take its place. You mentioned computing at the edge. When we talk about 5G is not just about the frequency. We always think about the bandwidth, but 5G has a whole lot to it, which includes being able to route in more than one direction, but also computing at the edge. So not all the information needs to go back up. At the compute at the edge, you can determine what needs to go back up, send that, changes to the system, and not send everything back up at one time. So that's some of the things that we can bring to the edge of the battlefield and reduce the signature on that from being detected.
Yeah, I'll just finish up with one key thing in consideration. I mean, first, it's, we haven't necessarily thought about this, or I know some people have, in terms of bandwidth as a class of supply. Okay, because really on the battlefield, there's a couple of things that come from it. One is, as I mentioned earlier, about those iron mountains of data. What's your compute and store capability at echelon? And General Morrison up at the G6 is already looking at those, tackling those problems and trying to reduce not just the actual equipment burden in terms of the number of form factors a company commander or platoon leader has to think about in the field, but also what is that transport requirement and what sort of risk does that introduce on the battlefield itself? Going back to that question about whether we should have a single system, I guess the Chinese system, if I remember correctly, is Log Inc. For their transportation system and the vulnerabilities that introduces. There's ways to kind of mitigate. There's pros and cons to that. Having the enclave and the system of systems, so long as those APIs are in place, so long as that data exchange is taking place, those are very effective. But it does require us to take that sober view of what is it that we want to know and how are we using that data. That will guide our protection efforts. But then, whether or not you want to use containerization or you want to run different types of measures in terms of what platform security, endpoint security, or network security stacks that you go with. But then also, how does that data end up traversing the globe, and what's that mapping look like across that architecture? And those are all challenging problems, but we are taking a look at that. But if you have those solutions or you have ideas, by all means, I'm listening.
So one of our audience members would like to invite everybody to the Global Expeditionary Logistics Symposium, 6 to 8 August, hosted by the Association of the Marine Corps, since we're talking joint endeavors, at Christopher Newport University. But he does have a question for you, Colonel Poland. How can we use contracting as strategic money as a weapon system? How do you use contracting as strategic money as a weapon system?
So I'm going to fall back to my first net example where we have a common item, it's a cell phone or any other thing that you would normally use to communicate. We have a contract to provide priority preemption with the government. During regular business, you can use your cell phone like you normally would. It is a cell phone. That's all it is. It's a cell phone. It's nothing special. I'll tell you about one of our, we had one customer that actually thought it was special. They put it in a blocker. And in a crisis, they were trying to get the phones out and put the SIM cards in them and get them ready to go. They should have been using them all the time. They were already paying for them. But the idea is that it's part of the commercial network. We have a partnership where we have spectrum that belongs to government. We have spectrum that belongs to AT&T. And in a crisis, the priority to that spectrum goes to the first responder. And if I always say, I'm there as the redneck trying to upload pictures of the Twister to Facebook, that first responder will get his call through ahead of me. And if there's enough of me and my redneck friends trying to upload pictures of the Twister to Facebook, they'll actually preempt us off of the network. So you could be paying for network transport services that you're using every day, that industry is using every day. In the event of a conflict, the contract says that you get priority and you get preemption for that network in the event of a national emergency. So that's my go-to move is a working partnership that we already have in place. It's already contracted for, and the service level agreements are very specific.
Any other? All right. General Kwon, I'm coming next to you. If a home station mobilization location or a force projection node were contested or disrupted by direct action or a terrorist event during a large-scale mobilization operation, how would the Army rapidly gain visibility on the impact to logistics and resync the enterprise to deliver logistics where needed the most?
No, that's a great question, ma'am. And so, I would offer that, in today's environment, operators and planners, you can't get away from the old, even though you have all the digital tools, you still can't get away from the analog. There are requirements for that to have some sort of backup in terms of, or some sort of sources that you can use while you bridge to bring your systems back online. Because sometimes it can take hours or days to conceive a plan to resync that support. But really, it gets back to that earlier point I made about, what data, and I would throw in also the infrastructure do we need to protect and what still needs to be developed to do that. We've taken things for granted in the past, and we've kind of white carded through some of our training iterations, or we just assume we're always going to make it out to NTC or JRTC, and we never have a problem there. But we operated under that basic assumption that we're going to have those basic services such as water, electricity. Even today now, the new one is the data center, because if you're moving toward cloud-hosted solutions, what's your on-prem capability versus what's in the cloud? So we have to think about that. And those presumptions are no longer sound anymore. And we have to take that into consideration, that oftentimes it doesn't have to be some sort of destruction or non-reversible negation of your capabilities that are out there. They just have to tie you up. And they have to tie you up for a couple of days. They just have to create crises, here in the homeland that we generally don't think about. Food security, or food insecurity, I should say, water insecurity. Those crises that will have people, kind of moving toward the gates of a local installation, as we talk about, if we decide that, hey, we're going to protect our own power generation capability or our own water purification and movement capability on an installation. Well, what about those Americans and family members that are just living right outside the gate? So that's gonna increase some of the friction of that. And all they have to do is tie you up for a couple days or a couple weeks. And they've increased the cost of deployment and engaging in that force projection to where they just erode right at our national will before we even get out of the gate. Not sure if you gentlemen have any other thoughts on that one.
You can't stop being attacked. And sometimes when you're attacked, you're going to take casualties. The issue is resiliency. How quickly do you recover? And so I know on the network side of the house, we have resources we can deploy to recreate an emergency infrastructure. We have devices that you put in a pickup truck, they're going to replace a cell tower. We have drones that can be used as broadcast, as antennas that we can have on site within a number of hours. We've had events here in the United States where infrastructure was destroyed. And the question was, how quickly could we get assets like portable assets like we have into place to get that infrastructure back up and running again? And I think we go through that every year in hurricane season. I'm in North Carolina, and I watch the convoy of power trucks go by every year. It all has to do with resiliency and being able to recover, get the things up and running again, get food supply moving again. A lot of that does start with the network and being able to report what do you need and when do you need it.
Right. And that's a great point, Dave. And that's one of those things that I also offer, that, we've got to get toward that competitive training. We have to actually lay that bare and go out there and figure out what's working, what's not working, and, leverage the networks, and also throw the switch. What happens when that goes right out? How do we see, how do we move? And don't just assume from that, because that's something, you mentioned the resiliency and the ability to push things up and down 95. Living in the area, it's always fun to watch, because Virginia or Dominion Power, as soon as something goes out in North Carolina, I see all the bucket trucks go southbound and clog up traffic on 95 to go help our fellow Americans. But that's a finite quantity. So what do you do when that hits multiple places at once? Also, sometimes we reach for in the total Army construct of it, we reach for the National Guard, we reach for the reserve component. but those individuals also come out of our communities. And so now you really have to weigh that balance and what capabilities can you push? I mean, COVID-19 and the pandemic, that was a classic example when it came to medical capabilities and what we had available, because providers, we wanted to activate them in uniform, but they were already on station for 18 hours a day in their local hospitals. So those are problems that we do have to think about, and TTPs and training that we have to engage in that are not traditional to where or how we've been engaged at this point.
Well, earlier I talked about having contracts and service level agreements in place for when that happens, but you can also do exercises to prepare for that. We participate in something called Jack Voltaic, where we have a scenario, perhaps it's a port we're trying to unload troops to go to theater, and there's a cyber attack, and there's different things that can happen. And it gives an opportunity for industry to work with the government and government agencies and the military all at the same time, and try to work out some of the kinks and some of the things that you may not expect. They did a hot topic on installation resiliency a couple of years ago when I spoke at. They voted here. We had an event where we had to had part of our network come literally under attack, and we were very resilient. We did a lot of things. But we also learned lessons we would never have learned had it been just an exercise. We learned from the real world. But doing more and more of those government and interagency exercises to prepare for that would help a great deal, because then you have more of a plan, you'll have more of experience getting it back online.
I'm going to go back to General LeMasters here for a minute, because I want to get some perspective from you. Over the last 18 months, you've been working heavily with one of our greatest allies, the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense. Anything that you can impart from your experience working with them, how they're thinking about these challenges?
I, of course, didn't hear the term contested logistic use, but I think as the Ukraine has done for many of the world, and some political changes inside, new chief of defense staff focused on things, talking about the greatest challenge since World War II, to the British military and folks on the island. I mean, they took on amazing things that really didn't make it into the news. I mean, they trained over 40,000 Ukrainian soldiers on the Salisbury plain, brought them in, we equipped them, they trained them and shipped them back out. Didn't see it on CNN, didn't hear anything about it, but it was amazing. And, the company that I worked for in the role that this program, we provided, commercial transportation of lots. I'll use that very technical term. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of containers of ammunition, major rolling stock on commercial contracted vehicles that, we provided, where we actually put them on military leased ro-ro vessels and took them across the channel and delivered them into Poland to be delivered. We also moved from any of the NATO partners who didn't want to be identified with white trucks providing, resources in. They looked at specifically the program that was established, the LCST program, where we built this massively new modernized distribution facility to facilitate our portion of that for the Ministry of Defense. They do things a bit differently. They have a fleet level management process for engineering maintenance for their major weapon systems. So they have major contractors that provide a lot of that maintenance above the unit level. But they started realizing pretty quickly that, this amazing efficiency that we've garnered and the savings that we were able to see for the defense also creates a major vulnerability as a massive single point of failure. Block the gates, do this, penetrate a software package. I mean, they've got the same types of concerns that we have as we go forward. And, this year they're facing, some of the largest heavy force deployments off the island into Europe to support NATO commitments that they've seen in many, many years. And the whole process of deploying forces through rail, air, relooking at those systems. Didn't get, of course, specifically into the higher level discussions about how they see their networks and their ability to monitor and manage all that. But I absolutely the same types of problems and challenges that we have here. And they, like us together as a NATO force on the continent of Europe, the ability to move on the battlefield at the operational tactical level, we face the same challenges, and then have to figure out that limited network, how we share that, as a combined team.
So Dave, for you, commercial comms networks are amazing, but the Russians used Ukrainian towers and had awful data leaks. The Ukrainians used Starlink and had real problems in Crimea. Should commercial networks be segregated between defensive and offensive operations?
Between defensive and offensive. I think officially industry is prevented by law from taking offense. So if you're asking if we can do cyber attacks on other people, we cannot do that legally. And I've talked to some people in industry, and they've had customers ask them to retaliate in the past, and they've declined to do so because it is a crime. Defensively, what we had going on in Ukraine was a little bit different. The Russians relied on Ukrainian towers because their communications were poor enough that they needed the Ukrainian towers to be able to function. And the leaks, bear in mind, they were acting on their host nation's network. So yeah, they had a lot of vulnerabilities to that, and they paid dearly for that. When it's your network that you're securing, and I'm talking about using American industry and allied industry, we have a lot more control over the network. I think would be a lot more secure for you. As far as how you, I would not necessarily divide it. Again, I'm saying take advantage of it, but understand it's a very different situation. The Starlink example, I can't speak to Crimea. I think they used Starlink in this round here, fighting with Russians. And there was an issue where Starlink was taken back from them, and there was some nip and tuck. But you have to understand that Starlink was given to the Ukrainians over a Twitter agreement. And I was in the Army for 30 years, so if I say anything bad about contracting, it does not reflect on AT&T, it's on me. But I'll tell you that I do think our contracting is a lot better than Twitter. And I think having an actual agreement, a contractual obligation, is a lot better than just a comment on social media. So we're looking at two different things.
Just to throw a couple piggyback on that, I mean, when it comes to using commercial networks, I mean, obviously encryption is one thing that you can leverage there, but there's also a thought to what's the latest challenges, or excuse me, the latest initiatives with sensitive but unclassified encrypted, right? And so, what is really that value of the particular, depending on the echelon that the formation is operating or using that local network? And if they're off the X before the adversary can even act on it, why does that really matter, right? So that really does kind of get into, again, training on that and developing the TTPs around that. And again, that's something else that the G6 has been looking into. Dave, to your point, I mean, legal agreements are key. I mean, those are the discussions that we've got to have now. And as I mentioned earlier with the training, that's where we get to flesh out, hey, do we have those legal agreements in place? Is there something that's going to be a stoppage? The other thing is did we policy ourselves into a corner? And if we figured that out, policy for DoD is a little easier to change as opposed to if we've got to go through local, state, or national law here at home. Because I see our folks over there in the corner nodding regarding from Northcom, but North, excuse me. But the other piece of it is when you're overseas. I mean, what do you work out with the host nation? And I mean, those are the discussion points, and we have to have that fluency in that language and know what questions that we need to ask right off the bat before we go in there. That also goes with those commercial providers. I mean, if they're doing network as a service or bandwidth as a service, whatever coin you want to use or term you want to use, that's going to be important to be upfront about it.
You're going to need to know, part of the agreement system is knowing in what countries do each of the carriers own or have operate rights to spectrum. Where do we have landing rights for fiber? This is where, again, all these details need to be worked out in advance. I want to add one thing too about the Russians being vulnerable. There's a difference between what's happening locally and what's happening in the network at large. Locally, you need to manage your cellular signal. I mean, it is a radio at the end of the day. And this is why, as I said earlier, limit how much you talk on the radio, right? One of the advantages of 5G, we push 5G to you as individuals, because it brings a lot more speed, a lot more cool things to your phone. But 5G also has a limited range, and you can adjust power to how far out you broadcast or don't. You can use a different antenna size or drones that you can take up to altitudes or lower, you can reduce your signature footprint. And then the rest of that is going to have to do with how you do the backhaul out of there. And our expeditionary kits, we keep a lot of these things in mind, is where is this going to be located on the battlefield, and how does it blend in with the spectrum that other people are using on the battlefield? What's the frequency ranges used in Ukraine? That's the kind of thing you need to be asking.
Another question from the audience. I'll start with General Kwon since it's addressed to you, but I think others may have some thoughts as well. How can new industry partners support the Army's additive manufacturing needs with the restrictive IP and tech rights in place? And I just want to make a call out for subtractive manufacturing too. Additive manufacturing is great, but we have great capabilities in subtractive manufacturing where you take a known data or known material hardness and just remove the parts that you don't need. We can do that very well at depots and arsenals, and can deploy that around the world. And we have for many, many years. It's another capability that I don't want to just dismiss. But this specific question really is getting after the IP and tech rights challenges, and how new industry partners that are not maybe tied in very well right now with the defense industrial base, how do they enter the market? And then how do they support these processes like additive manufacturing with the IP and tech rights? Any thoughts?
So I guess I can start primarily. I'll kind of stay topical because I know there's a larger debate regarding intellectual property following the publication of an article about a month ago from another OEM out there that kind of was pointing a finger at the department regarding how we want to lock up the IP, if you will, or just have exclusive rights to it. It is a tough problem, and we've got to be clear about the ownership on this stuff. I mean, SLAs are great, but what do you do when something goes bump in the night? We don't have time to really kind of go after that renegotiation of that legal agreement in terms of what are the left and right limits on how we do this. I mean, when we're employing a technology on the battlefield, the risk is that it just won't work, or the use case has changed because the battlefield is maturing and changing so quickly these days. For those who probably were in the computer science department with me at one point, Moore's Law, that's firmly dead today. That thing is long gone. Anyone who talks about it, I can pretty much date them as probably which textbook that they had. But the way that this is evolving and quickly is going to require us to really kind of have that open dialogue and discussion there, because we understand the companies don't want to have their IP out there and then end up having that compromised because that gets at the bread and butter of their survival. But at the same time, we have to have the ability to modify the use cases and make sure that we're adapting that. This does go toward, we both share, I guess I'll just finish up by saying we both share the same interest in that we don't want to erode anything on our national advantage to other adversaries or other parties that may wish to do the country harm. But otherwise, I'm going to have to punt to the legal teams because they are actually chewing on this question right now.
I always like to say, get a bunch of lawyers in a room and then close the door and take the oxygen out. But I think it really comes, Dr. Jetty hit on it, Ms. Cummings hit on it again. I mean, first, I think government and industry have to challenge each other about what is really IP, what do we use and how we use it. She was talking about some really interesting ideas about what portions do we really need to have access to, and then how do you put clauses and things in legal documents that says, in case of national emergency, I need it, I got to have it, we'll sort it out later on. I don't know, Dave. You got more experience in this than I do.
I will tell you, first of all, I'm always nice to my lawyer and anyone preparing my food. So, this is not my lane. I don't know a lot about this, so I'm going to pass.
Okay, we're coming, we got about 3 minutes left. I did want to give you all an opportunity for any closing thoughts, things that we didn't cover that you really wanted to make sure that the audience heard from you. So wrap up.
All right. I guess, I'll just close real quick. Basically, we all have various initiatives that are out there, and, we're all marching to the sound of, where the chief is pointing, with the initiatives to transform and contact. But we don't have time to lose. So we've got to be efficient. That's well understood. And make sure that we're coordinating across those multiple lines, whether it's in the building, whether it's, talking with industry. We don't have time to wait for the next GOSC to kind of figure out when this problem needs to come up. So, one of the things, we're even looking at from the G3 side of it, We're looking at, are we talking at the right levels? I don't want to be talking about critical capabilities on teams. So yes, will this require some of you to come into the building or us to go visit you? Absolutely. But it also requires us to have those discussions and just be really candid and open about it. So from my part, I'll say again, thank you again to AUSA and General McQuistion about having us here and talking about this critical topic. I'm pretty sure there's going to be some questions off to the side there, and look forward to chatting with some of you over there.
It's the collaboration between industry and government, and it's government from a joint perspective. It's what's the plan and how we're going to get after it, and how do we narrow that focus down on those most important things, separating that buckets of information that require network access into the things that are clearly administrative versus the things that are critical to enabling deployment of forces, sustainment of forces, and how that shifts over the timeline. And it's really turning that into a campaign plan that we can hold ourselves jointly accountable for. Dave.
The only thing I think I haven't said is that in a near peer fight, industry is going to be involved in the fight, whether you involve them in the fight or not. The financial industry is going to be threatened. The commercial transportation is going to be threatened. All our utilities are going to be threatened. So industry is already in the fight. Let's involve industry from the DoD perspective in the fight and plan for it ahead of time.
All right. Thank you all for a wonderful panel. Thank the panel members. And we have a big round of applause for the panel members. To each of you for submitting your questions. Thank you so much. For the hundreds of people that are viewing online, thank you all for participating as well. Enjoy your hot sauce. Keep working these problems. They're hotter than that sauce is.